Good afternoon, and welcome to the Granny Annie Family Stories Festival. My name is Connie McIntyre. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Granny Annie, and I'm really happy to have you all here today. This program today is presented in collaboration with the Missouri History Museum, and we are so very grateful to them for this beautiful space to gather in today, and also for all of their organizational and technical help with the program. For those of you who don't know, the Granny Annie is a nonprofit volunteer organization. We're headquartered right here in St. Louis, Missouri. And for the last 12 years, each year, the Granny Annie has invited students everywhere in grades 4 through 8 to learn something interesting about their family's history and capture it in their very best writing and share their story. This year, almost 1,000 students took part in the Granny Annie, and 621 submissions were received. So we're very fortunate today to be celebrating family stories with a number of those authors and illustrators and story keepers. And really, today is also a celebration of all of the students who took part, and it's even a celebration of you and your family's stories. My guess is that as you're listening today, you'll be reminded of some story from your family's past, or maybe you'll be reminded of that question you've been meaning to ask someone in your family to learn more about something from your family's past. Whichever it is, I hope you follow up on it and share the story that you learn. So let's begin this celebration, this great grand celebration of every family's stories.
Boomer Sooner, 1889-1954, Ash Creek, Oklahoma. It all started with my great-great-great-uncle Charlie's dad, Harrison. In March of 1889, my 4x great-uncle heard an announcement from President Benjamin Harrison. He was opening up the Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma to settlers to stake and claim. The only requirement to get a 160-acre tract of land was to make improvements on the land over a 5-year period. After the 5 years, the settler would receive a deed for the land in his name. Harrison decided to seize this opportunity. He left his family behind in Nebraska, mounted his fastest horse, and rode all the way to the Kansas border. When he got there, the troops that were guarding the land stopped him. Instead of letting the settlers go straight to Oklahoma, the troops directed them around the Kansas border. It definitely was not an easy journey. There were several times when it would have been easier to turn around and give up. Harrison was traveling with several other settlers when he came to a flooded river. The path to Oklahoma was completely blocked off. There was no way around it. Instead of accepting defeat, though, the settlers joined together and came up with a solution. They took boards from a railroad station and built a bridge. By working together, everyone was able to cross. On the day before Easter in 1889, my 4x great-uncle arrived at the Indian Territory. It was not the opening day yet, so he waited and passed time with the other settlers by playing games and running races. April 22nd finally arrived, and the settlers all started to line up. My uncle lined up very early. While he was waiting, he got thirsty, but he didn't want to lose his spot in line. Little girls came by selling spring water for 5 cents. He thought that was way too much for a cup of water, but he bought it anyway. At the strike of noon, a gun went off, which signaled that they could finally enter the Indian Territory. Harrison and his horse were going as fast as they could. Once he found the land he wanted, he staked his claim, registered it, and immediately began making improvements. He dug a well and cut down trees to start building a house. Over the next 5 years, my 4x great-uncle would make several more trips between Nebraska and Oklahoma. After the 5 years were up, he moved his entire family to Oklahoma. The land run was a huge opportunity, and my Uncle Charlie was happy to be a part of the boomer generation. It wasn't until 1954, when my Uncle Charlie met my great-great-grandpa Charles from the other side of the family, and they began talking about their roots, that my Uncle Charlie learned that Charles came from the Boomer Sooner too. Charles told my Uncle Charlie that he had some Indian friends in the territory, so he had come up 2 weeks early and had just pretended to arrive when everyone else did. He was happy to have arrived soon enough to get the land he wanted. My family truly is a Boomer Sooner family.
The Montgomery Indians, Patterson, Missouri. In the late 1800s, great-great-grandpa Joe moved from Virginia to Wayne County, Patterson, Missouri. He was in his 20s, and he would go to the Holmes Cave to have a square dance with all the neighbors. There was a part of the cave near the mouth that had collapsed and made a perfect dance floor, and the musicians sat on the ledge above the cave's entrance. People tied the horses and buggies on top of the cave. A sinkhole was about 30 feet back on top of the cave. One night at a square dance, a horse escaped with a buggy and fell into a sinkhole, and it didn't live. About 40 years later, Grandpa Johnny Montgomery was a young boy and lived in a 4-room house. It had a kitchen, living room, and 2 bedrooms. Grandpa Johnny and his siblings had to walk across the porch outside to access their 2 bedrooms. The house had no electricity and was heated only by 2 stoves. One was a kitchen stove and did not provide as much heat. To keep their produce cold, they would always go to Holmes Cave across the road, where it was always about 60 degrees. Grandpa Johnny and his siblings would play in the cave and use pine knots for light. After the lights went out, they would draw on the walls with the burnt remnant of the pine knot. Soon Grandpa Johnny grew up and had kids of his own. He found out the Holmes Cave had been open to the public. He took his own kids to see the cave that he played in as a child. When they were on the tour guide said, "The markings on the cave walls are from Indians, and the damaged stalagmites are from the Indians' torches." After the tour was over, Grandpa Johnny told the tour guide, "The Montgomery Indians made the drawings on the wall, and I am one of them." He also showed the tour guide a secret room that they didn't know of. The cave now is called Rebel Cave, but is not commercially operated at this time.
Abandoned. 1928, New York to Atchison, Kansas. I've faced some ups and downs, but mostly my life's been great. I have food and a roof over my head, and I've never imagined life without them. Some may say I took my life for granted, until I heard the story of my great-grandfather. With no shoes on his feet or a blanket when the weather dropped, he only knew poverty. In Italy, Jim's parents had their own American dream, but America didn't go exactly as they dreamed. They spent their last penny to buy tickets to America and journeyed from their homeland to the dreamland. At the end of the day, they had cuts and scars for little pay and had 6 children to raise. As if their situation couldn't get any worse, Jim's father died. Jim's mother was never around. She worked before the sun rose, and Jim was already asleep when she returned. With no other choice, Jim's mother had to say goodbye to her 2 oldest children. Jim was only 6 and his sister was 7. At such a young age, all Jim could wonder was why. Soon he and his sister would leave the busy streets of New York City and ride to the quiet plains of Kansas on the orphan train. Jim will never forget the expression on his mother's face as she sent him away. Jim walked onto the train, heart pounding, leaving everything as he stepped on some dirty train. All he could hear was crying, babies who didn't know better, kids who missed their parents, and his own weeping. Jim looked out the window to see his mom for his last time. He saw tears roll down her face. Why would she do it if she was so devastated? Despite all the crying and screaming, Jim managed to fall asleep as the sun began to set. Morning came, and Jim no longer saw the tall buildings and bright streetlights of the city. Instead, he saw cornfield after cornfield. "Do you really think we'll find a home for all these kids?" Jim heard an older lady say to a man. "Yeah, nowadays people need extra help on their farms. Most of these kids will just work, but it'll be fine. Better than their old life anyway. Plus, the siblings don't have to be in the same family." Was this really true? Jim dreamed of nice, loving parents, but now they'd probably beat him if he didn't work hard enough. And without his sister, she was all he had left. Would anyone want him? He was all alone with nothing left. As days went by, Jim found a family who took him in like their own. Sadly, he never saw his sister again, but he persevered through the adversity he faced to live a better life. He even went on to serve our country in World War II, conquering hardships and suffering to provide a better life for Americans. The hardships my great-grandfather faced have made me more grateful for my life.
When I was 6 years old, the longest amount of time that I was away from my parents was the 7 hours I spent at school. I can never imagine what it would be like if I had to say goodbye to them for most likely the rest of my life, just as Jim and his sister had to leave their mother in the story. The emotion in this scene helped me choose the story and to illustrate the climax. I wanted to have the despair that Jim and his mother must have been feeling translate into my illustration. That is why I wanted to draw this truly heartbreaking event in Abandoned.
Camp Camera. It happened in about 1939, Novi Sad, Poland. Rivka and Shlomo, my great-grandparents, had just gotten married in 1939. They lived in a small home in Poland. Germany had just taken over Poland. The Germans were anti-Semites, so they were very mean to Jewish people. Rivka and Shlomo didn't know that the Germans were anti-Semites. One day, Rivka was at home by herself. A German officer broke into the house, looked around, and didn't say a single word. All Rivka had were a camera and her Shabbos candles. Rivka was scared but stayed quiet. The German officer took the camera and walked out of the house. Shlomo came home and saw that Rivka was upset. Rivka told him what had happened was the German officer. Shlomo went to the police station to report what had happened. He saw a lot of the important Jewish people being rounded up and put into jail. Suddenly, a German officer grabbed Shlomo by the collar and wailed, Do you speak German? Luckily, Shlomo spoke a lot of languages, and German was one of them, so Shlomo replied in German, yes. The German officer yelled at Shlomo and said, Get me a dog. My wife wants a dog. So Shlomo ran and searched. He somehow found a dog. Then he zoomed back to the police station and gave the officer the dog. The German officer said, Good job, Jew. Go home. Shlomo then hired a Jewish man with a wagon and horses and took Rivka, 4 friends, and another couple and escaped Poland. At first, when the camera was stolen, Rivka was very upset. But if it weren't for the stolen camera, they wouldn't have escaped from Poland and the Germans.
A story that could have changed my life. 1941, Athens, Greece. I glanced up to my grandpa, who was rocking back and forth in his chair. I rubbed my palms on the shaggy carpet, spelling out my name while wondering if I should ask him this question. Papu? I whisper in a hushed tone. Will you tell me a story, a story when you were my age? Of course, he tells me with his strong Greek accent. He pauses a few seconds before he begins speaking. Well, in World War II was happening, I was in the middle of it. I was living in Athena on an average day until my buddies invited me to play soccer with them. We headed toward the middle of town to the only soccer field around. We were having a blast until what? Till what? I bellow while fidgeting with the shaggy carpet. Till we heard screams and shouts. I froze while the ball bounced off my feet. One of my friends met eyes with a guy dressed in a uniform, someone he didn't know. A bullet chased after him until it struck. We were all astonished and didn't know what to do. One thing I knew was to evacuate the area. We heard the piercing sound of another bullet that was shot and struck successfully. We knew what was happening. The Nazis were invading Greece. I felt sick to my stomach. Pow! A bullet was shot. It was headed for me. I ducked, but not enough, for it clipped my ear. Collapsing straight to the ground I went. My hands, without even thinking, burst right up to my ears. No, 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 I shout. Papu keeps chattering like he doesn't hear me. I heard a faint blare of ringing, he continues. My head started to ache. I still managed to stay hidden. I told myself, it's not going to end like this, which it hadn't. Things started to blur, and everything went black. Papu's voice gets rusty, and he stops speaking. I glance up to Papu, his eyes pitch black. He is in the moment. I hesitate, then ask, is everything okay? A tough, firm, courageous tear drops down from his cheek. I rush up to him in his rocking chair and give him a great big hug. Has anyone ever called you a hero? He shakes his head no. Well, now they will, because you are my hero.
I chose this story, a story that could have changed my life, because it really spoke to me. The fact that the child's grandfather survived amazes me. He was in the middle of a soccer field and surrounded by heavily armed Nazi soldiers. Jewish people that lived during World War II had a harsh life. People that survived the Holocaust inspire me. They prove that there's always a chance. Don't give up. Keep fighting. Stay determined. These keys give you more hope. Even if you think you're trapped, there's always a way out. That's why I chose this story.
Eyes of Fear. 1944, St. Louis, Missouri. I stared at the camera when it flashed. I tried to smile, but Mama had my braids in so tight that it made my head ache. I was sitting next to my father, who was wearing one of his best suits that day. It made sense, because it was Christmas, but I could tell he had something on his mind. And it was not because Joan and I had gone into his cigars again. No, it was something more serious. 3 weeks ago, my Uncle Randall has gone off to fight in the war. My father was a strong man, but I could tell he was afraid. I glanced at my older sister, Joan. She gave me a dirty look. I could tell she was still mad at me. Last week, I found her diary. Being the brat, what she liked to call me, I blabbed to everyone I knew. I had fun until she got back at me by pushing me down a hill while I was roller skating. Finally, dinner was served. After eating some chicken, I went into my room for the rest of the night. The next morning, I walked downstairs to see my mother in the kitchen. I asked her where everyone was. She said, Papa is in the living room watching the television set, and Joan is out. Joan was out? This early? It didn't sound like her. I decided to go look for her. I walked past the living room to see my father staring at the television. He had that look of fear in his eye. It was as if a dark cloud was over him that wouldn't go away. This terrified me. Joan always said I was a chicken, especially when I saw spiders. But to have Papa be afraid was more than I could bear. I did not know what I could do, but I needed to find Joan. I hopped on my bike and took off towards town. I passed all the spots Joan liked to go, but she was not there. I even asked Joan's friends if they had seen her, but they hadn't. Losing hope, I decided to go home. But then I remembered one more place. I burst down the road, and then into the woods, and then into the blackberry field. As I scanned all of the bushes, I saw Joan crouched into a ball. I ran over to Joan to find her crying. She looked up at me and had the same look of fear as my father. Joan wasn't the best sister. I had the scars to prove it, but I'll never stop trusting her. We made our way home, and then to the kitchen to see my mother and my father. Mother was holding a box of chocolates. Mother stood there smiling and then said, "It's from your Uncle Randall." I looked at my father, who was standing right next to her, and for a moment I thought I saw his eyes light up.
Camp Dread, 1945, northwestern Poland. It was sometime around late February or early March when my great-grandpa was on his way to Poland with the army during World War II. The road was cold, and my great-grandpa was trying to prevent the Nazi army from reaching the Allies' main army, which was currently trying to get deeper into Germany. When my great-grandpa's group was walking the road to Poland, they came across a small village. There weren't many people living there. One of the soldiers spotted a dirt trail through the woods, so they followed it. It led to what one would call a small town, but instead of houses, there were barracks. There were bodies lying everywhere, and the small place was surrounded by a barbed wire fence. When the men saw a few German soldiers, they realized it was a Nazi concentration camp. My great-grandpa's group of soldiers quickly shot the Germans. In each corner of the barbed wire fence there was a stone tower. There was an odor so foul it hurt. When my great-grandpa's group entered the camp, there were half-dead people crawling on the bloody turf of the camp. Many of these people were missing several limbs. There was a trail in the back of the camp that led a mile or two into the bosque that surrounded the camp. At the end of the trail were a few pits filled with the corpses of captives. The soldiers walked through the camp only to find more and more of what looked like zombies. These zombies all had numbers tattooed onto their skin. These people were sick. They had been tortured and starved so badly that you could see their bones through their skin. These people were going to die, so my great-grandpa and the rest of the soldiers went back to the small village to get help. They gathered all men 17 and older to help the people at the concentration camp, whether they wanted to or not, and most of them did not want to. They led the villagers to the camp to help the soldiers and aid the zombies. The soldiers tried to give the people of the concentration camp drugs to make them feel better. The soldiers wrapped the wounds of the people in gauze and bandages. They tried to identify the people by asking the villagers, but sadly, many of the people's identities remained unknown. The soldiers forced the German civilians to take the dead bodies to the trenches. After several days of hard work, the area was considered safe. The soldiers continued on their journey to Poland. My great-grandpa has seen some gruesome things, but none of them can compete with the horror, the stench, and the gore of those days in Germany. Thank you.
A Sweet Treat, Eden, Illinois, 1947. Growing up poor is never easy and definitely isn't fun. In 1947, a quarter was an immense amount of money, especially to a dirt poor 5-year-old boy. It was the month of August 1947, and the hot, humid southern Illinois sun beat down on anyone who dared to step out of the shade. My grandpa Bill, 5 years old at the time, was walking alone on a dirt road in his messy jeans and t-shirt. His suspenders were too tight, and his thick country accent was as deep as an accent can be for a 5-year-old. He walked alone because his mother and siblings were working. My grandpa Bill was poor growing up, but he and his family worked hard to make ends meet. Rarely would he see money, especially big coins such as a quarter. Back when he was a boy, 25 cents was practically worth $25. Nowadays, my grandpa walked alone on the dirt road, and he was kicking rocks as he went. As he looked down at the rocks he displaced, something shimmery caught his eye. He bent down, and sure enough, just lying on the ground was a shining quarter, a whole 25 cents. Ecstatic, my grandpa picked up the coin and pondered what to do with it. After a few minutes, he decided to go to the general store in his town and get delicious, cool ice cream on a warm summer's day. "How many ice cream cones can I buy with a quarter?" he asked the clerk. "5, a nickel a cone." "I'll have 5 then," my grandfather said. He walked out holding a tray with 5 vanilla ice cream cones in the tray and a huge smile on his face. Now, normally, my grandpa was a kind, generous boy, but the excitement of being able to have 5 whole ice cream cones all to himself sounded great to him, so happily he skipped to a ditch, a place where he could eat his ice cream in private. The ditch he sat near was right next to the dirt road, so every time a car would pass, dirt would fly and his vanilla ice cream would look a little like chocolate. But nothing could prevent my grandpa from joyfully gobbling down his ice cream. The taste was more than satisfying as it dripped down his cheek. But eventually, little by little, drop by drop, his creamy ice cream started to melt more and more. My grandpa could only fully devour only 2 of the 5 cones he got, before they all melted and he got full. But throughout the entire time he was eating, he was so very thankful for what he had. The lesson my grandfather learned was that you should never spend all of your money at one place. However, if you do spend all your money at one place, you should always share what you have. Thank you.
I chose to illustrate the story A Sweet Treat. The name really stuck out to me because who doesn't like a sweet treat, especially on a hot day? After reading through it a few times, I chose it because I could totally relate to wanting ice cream and not being able to afford it, and then suddenly being able to. The scene I chose to illustrate was the one where he was sitting in a ditch because I want to show his perseverance of trying to eat all 5 cones at once. He got his ice cream and nothing was going to stop him from eating it, even though there was dirt in it most of the time. Whether it's in the past or the present, we can all relate to wanting ice cream and spending all our money on it. Thank you.
My story that I made was called The Empty House. It is about my uncle who staged a house so that robbers could knock on the door, they could catch them. So in this story, it says that my uncle was a police officer who worked for the vice assignment.
Thank you.
So when my aunt came home, she saw that everything in her house was gone. Everything, like beds, chairs, even towels. And so she calls my uncle, and so my aunt was really scared. So my uncle says that he took all the furniture to stage the house. Thank you.
Hi, my name is, and my story is The Kindest Farmer. It was about my great-grandfather, who was in the army during World War II, I'm pretty sure, World War II, and he got separated from the rest of his group. It was only him and his friend, and they found a farmer who took them in and helped them and fed them, and then they found their group, and they got back, and they got home safely.
The explosion. It was a warm spring day in Joplin, Missouri in 1948. The air was fresh and cool. Today, 11-year-old, blonde-haired and blue-eyed Charles woke with an idea that was eating him whole. He thought, why don't I get rich by mining? So he got up, dressed, and went to his friend Clyde's house. He woke up Clyde and explained his idea. Clyde and Charles gathered their friend Bob, picked up their shovels, and sprinted to Clyde's land. They decided to start in a small pasture. The friends dug until they had a medium-sized ditch. They had reached a thick, hard layer, or clay. If you don't know about clay, it is very hard to get past, and Missouri is full of it. So Charles, being the head of the group, decided they should get through the clay with explosives. Charles remembered seeing an old shack by an abandoned mine. The 3 boys decided they should go see what, if anything, was in the shed that might help them. The boys crawled around and found fuses, some gooey stuff, and explosives. They went back to the field and put the gooey stuff on the explosives and struck a fuse in the heap of danger. They had enough sanity in them to construct a bunker for when the explosion went off. After everything was set up, they realized, who's going to light the fuse? The boys pulled straws and Clyde lost. Clyde went down to the blast site and lit the fuse. Then he ran as fast as his legs could carry him and hopped into the bunker. They waited and waited until they were sure it had been a dud. Then they were in a spot where they had to draw straws again. Clyde must have had bad luck that day and lost for a second time. Clyde slowly inched toward the explosives, and just as he peered over the lip of the hole to check the fuse, he suddenly seemed to revive and ran. Then an almost biblical pillar of fire burst from the dirt, and a ripple started. All of a sudden, it seemed like Clyde was a puppet that was picked up by the puppeteer. Before Charles knew it, he was in the air too. As soon as the moment had started, it passed. Charles lay on the ground, eyes to the sky, and thought, how did I get in this position? He turned his head to see what was happening. He saw Clyde's mouth moving, but all he could hear was the ringing in his ears. For 2 straight weeks, all the boys did was fill in the hole that they had created. They did find out that the gooey stuff was nitroglycerin. This story is an example of a close call. Charles is my grandpa, and he told this story to my mom, who in turn told it to me. The moral of the story is to not do dangerous things like this unless your luck is extremely good.
The reason I chose this story, because it featured 3 boys messing around with explosives, inspired me, and I thought it was cool how the story had so many great elements, making it easy to illustrate. I chose simple, thick black lines for the landscape and faces. The focus really comes down to the eyes and the expression in them. On the ground, I used a pointillism technique to show texture and value. The explosion and action are in the foreground, while 2 boys in the bunker are in the background. This shows depth of field. I really enjoyed drawing the characters more like cartoons. My favorite part was the boys in the bunker because it was funny.
Rivka's Daily Journey. 1950s, the Bronx, New York. Anytime you'd walk into my great-great-grandmother, Rivka Buell's house, the soup would be cooking on her stove, smelling as lovely as a field of roses, ready for its long journey the next day. Rivka Buell's, who I am named after, was only 4'11", but she was a strong woman. Every day, she would go to the Beth Abraham nursing home in the Bronx, no matter what the weather. Rivka would start her journey every day by packing up heavy glass jars of soup and chicken and stuffing them into her cloth shopping bags. Then she would trudge all the way to the L train. The L train was a train that ran on tracks elevated above the ground. Since the train was above ground, Rivka had to climb up all the steps to the train with her bags of all the food. Since she was a small woman, she would have to stop every few steps to catch her breath. Then Rivka would take the train. She would get off the train and have to walk down all the steps. When she got to the bottom of the steps, she would start walking again. As she kept walking, she had to stop every few blocks to catch her breath. She would get to the nursing home and see the familiar faces waiting to be fed. She would feed the people, no matter how they looked or what had happened to them, because some of the people had injuries that made it hard for them to eat. The nurses didn't have enough time to deal with all of them. After all the food was eaten, Rivka was ready to begin her journey back home. My great-great-grandmother was always trying to do good. She got an award for her work at the Beth Abraham nursing home. She was a great woman and left an impact on everyone who knew her through all of her good deeds.
It's a family tradition. My story started in the 1950s and is still going on today in Nebraska. What started as a fun family event over 65 years ago has turned into an annual highlight of the Blue Hill, Nebraska 4th of July Festival. In the early 1950s, my great-grandfather, Gilbert, or Gib, Shunk, started doing a fireworks show for his family and some close friends in Blue Hill. This small family event has developed into a family fun all-day Independence Day celebration. My grandpa Roger Shunk was born in 1947, and when he was only 3 years old, his dad, Gib, started lighting off fireworks for his family and some friends. When the fireworks show first started, there was a potluck dinner beforehand, and anyone was welcome to come for dinner and stay to watch. My great-grandpa Gib and his wife, Anna, owned a hardware store, so they were able to order special fireworks to light off. The number of people attending started to grow because the fireworks show became popular in the small town. The city of Blue Hill approached my great-grandpa Gib around 1967 and asked him to put on a fireworks show for the whole town. Within a few years, The community club started to provide a pork barbecue before the fireworks show. Soon after, a parade was added before the barbecue dinner. My great-grandpa Gibb passed away in February of 1981, so my grandpa Roger took over the fireworks show for him. Today, the Blue Hill 4th of July Festival includes golf, softball, and sand volleyball tournaments, kids' games, and a classic car show, in addition to the parade, barbecue, and fireworks. Managing a fireworks show as big as this is a lot of work. Each year, my grandpa Roger is required to have a license to light off the fireworks. He orders the fireworks in early April and requests permits in late May. The fireworks are delivered in mid-June and get organized into the order of the show. On July 3rd, my grandpa Roger and some helpers dig about a dozen holes to put the fireworks in when lighting them. These holes are dug on the Blue Hill Golf Course, which is where the fireworks show takes place. On the morning of the show, my grandpa Roger makes sure all of the supplies are ready and organized. It takes about 15 volunteers, including my Uncle Mike and Uncle Terry, to make the show run smoothly. Starting at 9:45 p.m., under my grandpa's direction, the volunteers light almost 300 fireworks. These fireworks are a mixture of ground displays, high-flying colorful bursts, and loud boomers, which are my grandpa Roger's favorite. This fireworks show is the highlight of a fun-filled Independence Day celebration. It is enjoyed by people from Blue Hill and surrounding communities. The fireworks show is a tradition my family is very proud to have started and carried on for so many years. My grandpa Roger passed away on January 10th, 2017. So this year my uncles would take over this tradition, which I know would make my grandpa Roger very proud.
Jewish American Princess, 1960, Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Let's imagine you find a piece of leather that has a deed on it. A deed indicates ownership of land. My cousin has found a deed like this, so let me tell you that story. One wonderful day, one of my relatives was cleaning out his dusty attic and found a piece of folded up leather with writing on it. He gave it to our cousin Bill Wick, who took the piece of leather to a professor at the University of Southern Mississippi in the city of Hattiesburg. The professor proclaimed that the piece of leather was a deed. The deed was for a part of New Orleans. That part of New Orleans is called the French Quarter. The question was, how had this deed come into my family? Let's go back to my 7th great-grandfather in Mississippi. His name was Simon Favre. He was Catholic. One day he met a beautiful woman. The exotic young woman was from the Native American tribe called Choctaw. In fact, her father was the chief. His name was Chief Pushmataha, Apushim Pushmataha. Eventually, Simon married Pistikio Kane Pushmataha. The chief used the deed as a dowry, an extraordinary wedding gift. We all know that no family owns the French Quarter of New Orleans. Upon making the amazing discovery of this deed, Bill filed a claim with the city of New Orleans to get our land back. The city of New Orleans didn't give our land back, but they did pay all my living relatives up through my great-grandfather's generation reparations for the land. That is the story of how I have a princess in my family. The princess is related to me through my maternal grandfather's family. Since I'm Jewish, that makes me a Jewish American princess.
The Unforgotten Months, 1966, Queens, New York. Mr. Weiss crossed his fingers. He'd been crossing his fingers for the last 55.5 seconds, not to mention the past month. Finally, someone came out and told him the dreaded news. He felt dizzy as a little baby wrapped in a pink baby blanket was handed to him. Questions swirled around in his head like bees whose hive had been ruined. His shoulders suddenly felt heavier than before. How would he take care of this baby, not to mention his 2 other kids, without a wife? The kids would grow up without a mother. It was then that he decided to name the baby Esther after her mother. Meanwhile, David and Evelyn Popick, my great-grandparents, were sitting around their dinner table when their phone rang and they were told the dreaded news. They knew what they had to do. Although they had 2 kids, Judy, who was 14, and Rhonda, who was 11, and although Mr. Weiss was only a distant relative, they offered to take care of Esther for Mr. for Mr. Weiss. After a lot of debate, Mr. Weiss gave Esther to David and Evelyn Popick to take care of for 3 months. My great-grandparents soon developed a fond relationship with Esther. David Popick loved Esther like a cat loves her kittens. Every day, he would push Esther in her carriage up and down the block over and over. He did that not to get to a certain place, but because he loved spending time with Esther. Often neighbors questioned, "Whose baby is that?" Great-grandpa would smile and proudly answer, "Mine," before returning home. Although to others 3 months may not seem like such a long time, to my great-grandparents and their kids it felt like forever. Maybe it was because of all the time my great-grandmother spent watching Esther, or because of how proud my great-grandpa felt whenever he was with her. Or maybe it was because of how happy Judy and Rhonda felt to have a new baby in the house. For all of these reasons, the Popicks grew to love Esther as if she were their own. Finally, the day came for Esther to be given back to her own family. Although the day was bright and sunny, to the Popicks it felt cloudy and cold. It was very hard to return Esther to her father, but they knew it was the right thing to do. Although the story took place 50 years ago, it's not forgotten. To this day, my grandmother Rhonda carries a picture of Esther in her wallet. And when my great-grandma Evelyn died a few years ago, Esther's family set cottage for her. My great-grandparents were kind people who stepped up when someone was in need. Their kindness led to a relationship between the two families that has lasted until this day. I'm proud to be their granddaughter, and I hope that I will follow in their footsteps one day.
I chose the USS Forrestal Fire because it was a historical event. Once I started reading it, I became really interested in the story. Since I like history, I loved how the story played out. I could picture what was happening in my head while I was reading. So, once I had my idea, I started drawing. Since the story included so many details, it wasn't hard at all for me to draw the whole scene. What I enjoyed about drawing my creation was all the details. I loved drawing naval ships and planes, so it all fit together perfectly. Once I finished the main details, I added some texture to finish it off. Thank you.
Trouble Developing, 1975, Los Angeles, California. Before I begin, it is important to travel back to 1975 to shift to a time when darkrooms were used to develop photos. And that is exactly where my dad was, the darkroom at Palms Junior High. It was a near-fatal day for my 4'8" 13-year-old dad, although he had no way of knowing this ahead of time. It all started when Jerome came into the darkroom. Now, in the prehistoric days of darkrooms, it was common knowledge that turning on the lights messed up the development of photos. Jerome, however, did not have the etiquette to wait until photos were done developing. So you can imagine the frustration of my dad when Jerome turned the lights on, flooding the room with light and ruining my dad's photographs. And so it comes as no surprise that my dad wanted to know who he could blame for ruining his photos. Therefore, he did the only logical thing to do. He yelled across the room, asking what fool had turned the lights on. Soon enough, he got his answer. A shadow hulked above his scrawny, petite body, and my dad looked up with terror. And then he looked up a little more and a little more until he finally found the eyes of Jerome. "This fool turned the lights on," rasped Jerome in a menacingly low voice. My dad gulped, and his heart began to race. I was just joking around," my dad stammered, but no excuse could save him now. Before he knew it, he had been yanked out of his chair as if he were merely a feather, and the bulking muscles of Jerome were locked around his tiny neck. My dad kicked and writhed, but struck only air, for his feet were dangling several inches off the ground. He gasped for breath, and his face slowly grew redder. This was past the point of embarrassment. This was life-threatening. Seconds ticked by, and my dad's fear grew. Then a hero appeared. A tiny girl, even more petite than my dad, dark brown curls bouncing, rushed to his aid. Aunt Linda.
She raced to free her brother from Jerome's grip, and as soon as she was within arm's reach, she shot out a fist, which landed squarely on Jerome's nose. He yelped in pain, and in all the confusion, released my dad. My dad used his remaining energy to dash away and take in a long, sweet gulp of air. Rumors flew like bullets that day, and many people asked Aunt Linda about the ordeal. Linda simply flipped her hair and said, "Oh, I just beat up Jerome. Don't worry about it." Then she strode off with her head held high, smiling from ear to ear. After all, she may have saved her brother's life. Thank you.
You are about to witness Granny Annie first. In all of our 12 years of Granny Annie history, we have never before had this opportunity. And I was a little surprised here because she didn't know I was going to ask her to stay up here with me. And I think the best thing for me to do is just to read what's on this paper. Is that okay with everybody? Okay. It says, whereas has had a historical family story selected for publication in Granny Annie each year she was eligible to do so. Grades 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. And whereas some years submitted more than one story that was selected for possible publication, causing the Granny Annie to establish the policy of publishing only one story per author per year. And whereas has enthusiastically read each of her published stories at the annual book signing or Family Stories Festival, and whereas said in a radio interview as a 4th grader that she'd been waiting her whole life to write for the Granny Annie. And whereas has consistently brought memorable stories to life so that readers can appreciate them in the same way she does. The Granny Annie Family Stories Celebration therefore recognizes as the first ever Granny Annie Storykeeper Ultra Extraordinaire. And there's more. And wishes her a lifetime of joy in discovering, writing, preserving, and sharing stories from her family's history, and in all of her writing endeavors. Congratulations. Thank you.
Saved by a 71-year-old. 1984, Pike County, Alabama. On a summer afternoon in 1984, my mother was at her grandparents' farm near Brundage, a small town in Pike County, Alabama. Her 10-year-old self was sitting in her typical perch, a fig tree in the side yard. Her 71-year-old grandfather came outside with his walking stick, a metal coffee can, and a Boston Terrier named Scooter. Her grandmother wanted them to go pick a coffee can full of blackberries so she could make cobbler for dessert that night. So they started walking down the dirt road towards the wild blackberry patch on the farm. Even though both of them knew there were snakes on the farm, they did not think they would run into any because they had never seen any on the road. They were walking and talking when all of a sudden my mother heard the unnerving sound of a rattlesnake's tail. She looked down and her foot was hovering over a rattlesnake that was ready to strike. She froze, not knowing what to do. Scooter took off back to the house, running as fast as her little legs could take her. Scooter had been bitten on the foot the previous year, and even the noise of a fly buzzing frightened her. Before my mother could think, her grandfather threw her through the air with one arm and began beating the snake with his walking stick. My mother sat on the ground staring at her grandfather, who was very elderly in her eyes, trying to catch her breath. The snake was coiling around in strange shapes as he hit it. Finally, he decapitated the snake. They didn't have blackberry cobbler that night. "Thank you for saving me," she told her grandfather.
As they walked back to the house, she felt terrified, but she was also thankful for her grandfather's reaction. It was satisfying knowing that someone would do that for her if she were in danger. It's one of my mother's most vivid memories of her grandfather that she doesn't think will ever go away. Even though it was a scary experience, she enjoys the memory of walking with her grandfather. The old man she saw as simply her grandfather was suddenly a hero.
I chose the story because I am a big fan of baseball and Ozzie Smith is a Cardinals legend. It was also a very interesting story to read. I enjoyed this project because we got to draw with pencil freely. I could draw whatever my mind wanted to draw about the story, and it chose to draw hills, a gas station, and the buildings of St. Louis. There was only one thing I was nervous about, and it was the amount of people in my grade that chose this story as well. All in all, I had a great overall experience working on my project.
A Creek Adventure. 1986, after Missouri. My mom told me this story from her childhood. I was a fairly anxious and twitchy kid. 1986 was a stressful year for me. My parents were divorcing, and I was having a rough time adjusting to middle school. One thing that helped me relax was spending time outdoors. One day, my sister, my mom, and I went to visit my godparents. They lived close to a creek under a train trestle. I loved to explore that creek. Hoping to find some toads, I journeyed after being warned not to ruin my shoes and looked under exposed tree roots by the bank. Suddenly, I saw the prettiest snake I had ever seen. I wanted so badly to catch it that I grabbed it without thinking. It bit me, of course, and I released it. As I was trying to figure out how I could still catch the snake, I saw a huge soft-shelled turtle cruising down the bank and into the water. I thought I was dreaming. I had never seen a soft-shelled turtle in the wild before. I jumped into the water with my shoes and non-waterproof watch and grabbed the back of its shell. It was soft and leathery, like no turtle I had ever felt. The turtle gave me a mean look, as if it was going to bite me, so I released it before it had the chance. I crawled back into the bank and realized that I had ruined my clothes, my shoes, and my watch, and had nothing to show for it. Later, I was so excited trying to tell my family what had happened that I was shaking all over and could not speak clearly. I led them to a creek, but of course they didn't see anything. They told me I needed to go home and get some rest. In the car, I saw 2 little holes in my hand and realized I didn't know if the snake that had bitten me was poisonous or not. Feeling fortunate I had not gotten in trouble for ruining my shoes, I did not want to bring up the fact that I'd been bitten by a strange snake. Before bed, I gave my cat extra treats and snuggled her close in case I did not wake up the next morning, because I knew she wouldn't miss me. Fortunately, I did wake up. However, I was unsure how quickly poisonous snake bites take effect. Wondering how much time I had left, I casually asked one of my teachers, Miss P, "How do you know if you've been bitten by a poisonous snake?" She told me the story about how her husband had been bitten on the arm by a copperhead, and within half an hour her arm was swollen and he was in horrible pain. After hearing that, I was relieved to know I wasn't going to die. Being bitten by a snake put a new perspective on things that had been stressing me.
The Ultimate Protector, around 1987, Merida, Yucatan, Mexico. It was 102 degrees in the seminary room with no air conditioning in Mexico. Ben, a student attending the seminary, was living with my dad's family. He had done some awful things in the past, but then quit and converted to Christianity. But soon what had happened in the past would come back to haunt him. One morning in the house where Ben was staying, the phone rang and Ben picked it up. A gruff voice said, "We'll pick you up at 2 p.m. tomorrow." Immediately, Ben knew what was going on. He told the family that he used to be in the drug cartel, selling weapons and smuggling drugs, and was second in command until he quit and became a Christian. Now the boss of the cartel wanted to see and talk with him. The next day, at 2 o'clock sharp, a black Mercedes pulled up to the house. The man inside got out a gun and told Ben to get in. They talked about Ben's life. The man let Ben out of the car, unharmed, but told him that he would have to see the boss of the cartel soon. My father's family prayed for Ben's safety and trip. The next morning, Ben woke up at 6 a.m. and got on a bus towards Veracruz where he would meet the boss. He knew that he was being followed, and when he arrived, the same Mercedes picked him up and a blindfold was put over his eyes. But when they arrived at the building, Ben knew exactly where he was. They took him to a small room with an armchair and a desk that the boss was sitting behind. In a deep voice, the boss said, "Take a seat." When Ben did, the boss started asking questions about his life. When they got to the topic of Christianity, Ben saw his chance and took it. Ben knew that he might get killed, but it was a risk he had to take. Ben said to the boss, "You can have anything you want, money, drugs, weapons, cars, but what you don't want but need is peace with God." He then reached into his back pocket, took out a Bible, and laid it on the desk. The boss took out a gun and aimed it right between Ben's eyes. Ben knew that he was going to get killed on the spot. He had seen it happen before. The boss's hand started to tremble, and he said, "I don't know why, but something isn't letting me pull the trigger. Go, you're free. But if I hear any news about you, I will hunt you down, and that time I won't let you live." Ben hopped onto the next bus home and arrived safely. He told the family everything, and they were amazed and praised God for protecting Ben. Ben is currently a pastor and living a cartel-free life. Ben stood up for what was right, even when facing danger.
Thanks for sticking with me just a couple more minutes. Through the selection process and the publishing process, I probably read these published stories 25 times at least. I practically know them by heart. But hearing them read by the authors is there's just nothing like it. Weren't they just terrific? And then the same thing with the artists, to get the chance to hear what was going through their mind when they decided which story to illustrate or how to illustrate the story. I really enjoy this day so much. I thank all of you for coming today and supporting these young people. It just warms my heart because creative endeavors are so important to the students themselves, but to all of us in our society. And I really appreciate that you've taken the time to support these young people today. If you like what you have seen here today, or if your family had a positive experience through participation in the Granny Annie, I hope you'll go to our website, thegrannyannie.org, and make a financial donation. A donation of any size would be so much appreciated by all of us who volunteer our time each year to the Granny Annie, but also to all those students next year who will be able to take part thanks to your support. So I hope you'll consider that. You've noticed that there are some cameras in the back here. The program was video recorded, and that will be available on YouTube, and I'm told in a few weeks we'll be able to get that up. So check back to our website or just go directly to YouTube and type in the Granny Annie 2017, and you'll be able to find that recording of today's program. Also, as you know, we've been taking photographs all day, and the photographs will be posted on our Facebook page, so you can have access to them from there. If you're a student and you haven't had your individual photo taken yet, please make sure you do that. And also, if any families would like a family photo taken by the Granny Annie quilt, my aunt would be very pleased to be in your family photo. What else? I had a list of things I was supposed to say very quickly. Let me tell you how we're going to do this. We're going to let the students leave first, and they're going to have an all-group picture taken. And while they're doing that, you have one last opportunity to run up to the museum shop if you have not yet purchased a copy of Granny Annie Volume 12, or maybe more than one copy would be great too. And also, there are copies of Echoes from World War II there. That was the book that was published recently by the Granny Annie in honor of our 10th anniversary. It includes stories about World War II from the beginning to the end, and the stories take place all over the world. It's quite a fascinating book. Then we will all gather in the AT&T room, which is just down the hall from here. It's on this same level, just down the hall. And we have the authors and artists will be there to sign your books. And they would be more than happy, I'm sure, to hear congratulations from you and comments about how their story or their art has affected you. So please take a few minutes to check in with them. And there are also, one more thing, there are some classroom Granny Annie books on display in the AT&T room, compliments of one of our schools in New York that wasn't able to be here today, but they have shared these books with us. I hope you'll take a look. It might give you some ideas of what you would like to see happen in your school next year with Granny Annie stories. And yeah, Martha, there are cookies. And you better get there before Martha gets there. No. I think that's everything. So let's let the students go first. Let's give them a clap as they exit.